VikesNow, I am Dustin Baker. February 17th, we're less than 4 weeks away from free agency. However, in the Vikings arena, we had a press conference with Brian Flores, the first time we're talking about it on the show. So I've brought Josh Frey on for the weekly segment. How you doing this week?
I'm doing good, man. We got Brian Flores press conferences, spring training starting up for baseball. Had to rep my Brewers this morning, so we're doing good. The vibes are high.
I should have wore my Twins hat if I knew you were going to bring that stuff on here.
Yeah, you really should have. Dang.
Yeah, next week. Book it. All right, so
Yeah.
the press conference. Here's the first thing I want to ask. Something I think we brushed under the rug is that 1 year ago, right about now, Ed Donatel gave a wonderful press conference that was full of optimism, setting the edges. It felt like a new day, and I think everybody left that presser thinking, "All right, this is going to work. This is going to be awesome." So I want to pump the brakes a little bit and say, like, even though Donatel's stock really fizzled, especially in the playoffs, we've heard great things from leaders before at press conferences. So which one do you think, based on a press conference, was more impressive? Donatel or Flores the other day?
I really think Flores kind of blew me away with this one just because he felt a lot more even keeled and he kind of felt a little bit more confident in what he was doing, handling himself up at the mic, like discussing what he was actually going to do with his defense. And even before the press conference, I think the most exciting part about this is the fact that it seems like him and O'Connell really have a really great chemistry. Like they were cracking jokes before they got into the meat and potatoes of this whole thing. And they were bouncing off each other really well on the questions. And it just seems like these guys have been in communications with each other for a while. They've been talking for a while, and they seem like they've got a really great chemistry. And I wrote after the press conference, one of my main thoughts was it I'm always going to believe that it's a lot easier to do your job when you're in a situation where you enjoy the people you're working with and you can really you're having fun, you know. So I think that this is a very promising sign for the Vikings moving forward. I'm excited to see what he can do with this team.
One thing that's kind of funny is when Flores was in the mill to become the next defensive coordinator, I remember researching the connection between O'Connell and Flores, and it was in 2008. O'Connell was just drafted by the Patriots, and Flores was an assistant D-backs coach or quality control coach. And I remember thinking, like, that's like this paper thin connection between the guys. I wonder if that even matters. And lo and behold, it seems like it really did. Like they were homies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just really speaks to the type of character that Flores has and what he really what his players think of him as a coach and how well he's respected across the league. Like we saw it when he got hired. Like there were so many former players of his and just players around the NFL that were posting on social media saying congratulations to him. And I couldn't be more ecstatic about how that hire went down, how everybody's responded to it, and the press conference. It just blew me away. I'm excited.
Yeah, I think it certainly, if there was any mystery, and I tweeted this the other day, if there was any mystery about whether or not they're going to try to win the Super Bowl again or just kind of do this rink-a-dink competitive rebuild, I think it was emphatically answered by the hire in the press conference that, yeah, they're going to, for the 8th year in a row, they're really going to in it to win it.
Yeah, I think that's what I said. I think if you want to go win a Super Bowl, this is the guy that you got to go get because he can do a lot of crazy things with the defense. We saw it in Miami. All the blitzes that he drew up, he's one of the more aggressive guys of the entire league when it comes to defense. And he brought that up and said he's aggressive, but he's not reckless either, which I think that really speaks to the kind of stuff that he's going to bring to Minnesota. And if if this team's ever going to improve to a point where they can compete to a Super Bowl, this is the guy that you got to bring in. This is the guy that you got to bring in for sure.
One thing he was asked, I think some of the reporters tried to get him to hint at an endorsement to personnel change. And while we'll still have that undoubtedly, he seemed to say, a lot of the guys here are the ones that I like. So I want to ask you, coming out of that press conference, I think I asked you a similar question a week ago. Based on the words you heard from Flores, which players would you consider now safer that perhaps you had on some sort of chopping block 3 weeks ago?
I think first off Harrison Smith, just because he's going to be he's one of the better blitzing safeties in the entire league still, even in his mid-30s now. But I think that he can have a really big role in Flores' defense just with the intricate things that he can do with safeties. And Eric Kendricks, I think, is another guy that I I feel like he didn't have a great season in 2022, obviously, and everybody's kind of writing it off as that, and he's just taking a step back. But I do think that there's merit to the point that it might have been something to do with the scheme, and that Ed Donatel just put a little bit too much on his plate last season. And if he can get back to some of the things that he was doing 2020, even 2021, where he's a guy that he can be a guy that can pass the quarter or rush the quarterback, because he had 5 sacks in 2021. He's one of the better run stoppers. He's a great pass coverage guy too. So I think that there's a world where he can bounce back. It's not going to be like the all pro type of player that we used to see, but I still think that he can be a quality linebacker in the NFL. So I think those are two guys that especially stand out to me as guys that might have been on the chopping block initially just because of salary cap stuff, but I think that they'll probably stick around.
I think also what happened, me included, and I think the Vikings community, is that the playoff loss was so embarrassing in the week after that our knee-jerk reaction was like, oh, we got to get a whole new defense. And all these guys are expensive, so we're going to get a whole new defense. And then once the emotions kind of wore off, it was like, well, these guys are longtime players. Some of them are still pretty good, and not all of them are going to leave town. Some of them will. So I think that's where the happy medium was met, was when bad shit happens, you're like, all right, we got to throw everything out, start over. And that's kind of how we felt, because they just couldn't stop Daniel Jones. And that's where we settle. All right, my next question, I hope, is the most exciting for you on this docket because of your draft brain. So I've asked you multiple times. You've said Trenton Simpson is the guy that you particularly like, if he's there at 23 for the Vikings. I know you have other draft crushes, but learning of the Flores hire, hearing the words from his mouth in the press conference, who most likely is the first Vikings defender chosen on April 27th or 28th?
So I think if we're taking into account the fact that they're probably going to trade that pick and move down probably into the second round and acquire another day 2 pick so they can keep building up that defense, I think a guy to keep an eye on is Maryland cornerback Deonte Banks, just because he's a guy for them that he basically was a lockdown press coverage cornerback for them throughout his entire college career. Not the greatest guy in zone necessarily, and he can definitely improve some of his technique stuff in coverage. But with a Flores defense, we talked about it when the hire first happened, you definitely need a guy that can be a lockdown corner, that can win the one-on-one battles against better wide receivers. And Banks is a guy that can definitely do that. And if they're drafting in the second round early, maybe like mid-30s, late 30s, I think that he's a guy that they'd probably go after with that pick. As much as it pains my Trenton Simpson heart to say, I do think that that's a good option. Another one would probably be if they're going to stick with the linebacker trend, if they're going to do that in the second round, probably Noah Sewell out of Oregon. I think that's a good area for him to go in. Kind of a similar skill. I think he's a little bit less polished, but he's got a great motor, sideline to sideline speed, can do just about everything. So yeah, I think those would be the 2 top guys that I'm looking at right now.
So that sounds like a prediction. Do you also like those 2?
Oh, I love those 2 guys. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. If I had a choice between some of the cornerbacks early in the second round that would go, or some of the linebackers that would go in the second round, I think those are two of the better ones for sure.
Who's just one guy right now? We have 69 days to get into the draft stuff. Who's one guy on the first round draft board for any team that you're like, meh, I don't see it?
It's hard to, because there are a lot of really good guys in this draft, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Like if we're digging into Viking stuff, like there's not a ton of guys in the first round that you would be too upset about having. I think Cam Smith out of South Carolina, he doesn't do it as much for me just because he's a really great athletic corner. He's got all the speed, all the athleticism in the world, and it's notable because you can't teach that sort of thing. You either have it or you don't. But his pass coverage technique and his tackling is super inconsistent. And I've seen him drafted. He's been mocked to the Vikings a number of times, and at 23 even. So I do think that if he's the guy that they're going after, I'd be a little bit worried about that just because I don't necessarily trust him, especially in year one, to be a guy that can really step in and be a starter for a defense. Maybe down the road he can turn into something, but like we talked about, Brian Flores is here to win a Super Bowl now. So I think that if they're going to go after a guy, I don't want it to be a project, kind of like an Andrew Booth type, where it's going to take a couple years to get him up to speed.
If the NFL draft was decided by volumes of mock drafters, then Cam Smith would be on the Vikings right now, because you are correct. He is the most mock drafted guy. Interestingly though, if you play around with PFF's mock draft simulator, he goes off the board in like the third round. So you evidently agree with them, or vice versa, because when I try to swing the trades, because I too think Kwesi will trade out of that pick, I end up getting Cam Smith in round 3, and I'm like, all right, I'm good, baby. But now I'll have to pump the brakes a little bit based on your outlook. Here's what I want to ask, winding down the show, and this is a fascinating one. So Ben Lieber, who was on this show a year ago, he played linebacker for the Vikings for 5 years, tweeted seemingly out of nowhere, but I'm pretty sure it was in response to Todd McShay's mock draft. He said something to the effect of, what's with all these credible people drafting wide receivers to the Vikings in round 1? Have you seen the team's defense? And he's right. The defense is the number one with a bullet priority this offseason. However, dudes like me, and I think dudes like you, believe that they can probably fix most of the shit in free agency and then use the best player available slogan in the draft. Bada bing, you're staring at a draft board that has Jordan Addison on it. You might think that's the best player available. So I want to ask you, not by proxy debating Ben Lieber, but do you think it would be silly to get a WR2 rather than defense with the first overall pick, no matter what position that's at?
Well, I mean, I think I'd point to immediately, if we're going to go by that logic, then why would the Cincinnati Bengals in 2021 draft Jamar Chase rather than offensive line or even defense there? Because they had obvious needs, and they just went out and got the best wide receiver that they could and made an unstoppable offense, and it got them to a Super Bowl. So I do think that, like you said, the Vikings can fix a lot of their issues in free agency. There's a lot of good guys out there, especially Brian Flores. If he can do a little bit of recruiting for us, that'd be really nice. Cam Sutton, come to Minnesota, baby. But I do think that if a guy like Jordan Addison is available, pairing him with Justin Jefferson and even KJ Osborne, TJ Hawkinson, that's 4 guys that are legit, and they can catch passes for you at any moment. And Addison especially, he's such an incredible route runner. He does everything so effortlessly, kind of like Justin Jefferson does. So pairing those 2 guys, I would not be upset about that at all, especially if they go get a linebacker, go get a corner in free agency. Might as well just go get the best player available, because if they can't stop you from putting points on the board, then it doesn't really matter how bad your defense is anymore.
Yeah, and if you have that embarrassment of riches on the offense, and then, by the way, you have Brian Flores running your defense, I don't think that he's going to allow his personnel just to be ho-hum. I'm going to guess that with his face in the room, good things are going to happen. And always remember, for folks that are getting familiar with Flores, his background as a young man is a scout. So that should be a wonderful lead up to his being in the room when it happened to draft a defensive player, because he does both. He can find the dudes and then he can coach them. So I think that's a little unsung fact that with the Patriots, that's how he came up as a scout. All right, sir, the last exercise we're going to do, I think this is pretty fun. All I want is a yes or no. You don't have to give me, you don't have to elaborate. I want to know, I'm going to go by defensive snap counts. I'm going to ask you if this player is on the 2023 Vikings roster, depth chart, September, blah, 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 week 1. You just give me a yes for he's on the roster. Nope, I don't think so. Cameron Bynum.
Yes.
Patrick Peterson.
No.
Eric Kendricks.
Yes.
Chandon Sullivan.
No.
Jordan Hicks.
Nope.
Harrison Smith.
Yep.
Danielle Hunter.
Yes.
Zadarius Smith.
Probably yes.
Harrison Phillips.
I think so, yeah.
It'd be really weird to get rid of him since you just brought him in. Yep. DJ Wanham.
Yes.
Dalvin Tomlinson.
No.
Duke Shelley.
Nope.
Jonathan Bullard.
No.
Patrick Jones.
Yes.
James Lynch,
Probably not.
Kairos Tonga.
Yes.
And then I think the rest are all rookies, and it'll probably be your Josh Metellus. That's a yay or nay.
I think yeah. Might as well. He's a really nice depth piece.
We can do this next week with the offense. There was one that you said, oh, so here's the deal. You said Duke Shelley pretty decisively. You said no. If that guy goes to a team like the Bengals and he has like a top 10 PFF grade again, he will certifiably be the one that got away because this fan base loves him. And you watch if he just blows up again because they play him at his right spot on the outside. Ooh, we're gonna lament not keeping him.
Yeah, I do think that it's going to be a little bit tricky. I think I have a little bit of concern that he might have been a little bit of a flash in the pan down the stretch of the season where teams just didn't have a ton of tape on him, and he was able to kind of get away with a lot of stuff that because he just was kind of an unknown going from practice squad to basically starter in 2 weeks. So I think that he'd be I think if they kept him around as like a CB3, CB4 type of player, I think I'd be fine with that, but I really hope that they're not hoping to rely on him as a starter again.
Yeah, I don't know if they would go into the season saying, he's our Revis Island. But I think the biggest problem right now, when you use that CB3, CB4 analogy, is we have like 5 CB3s, or we have like,
I know.
Yep, about in the orbit. If you consider Shelley and Peterson, we have about 5 CB2s and CB3s, and no CB1 unless Shelley is truly a phenomenon or Patrick Peterson plans to play like he did last year, which is a big if when you hit age 33 or whatever. All right, man. We talked a little bit off air. Next week, we'll start to seriously bang the drum on free agency. I think we'll go through the list of unrestricted free agents that are in the purple clothes right now. We'll spitball whether or not they'll be back. I think a lot of them will probably be no, but we'll go through all of those. And then the following week, start to predict who Kwesi Adofo-Mensah will bring to the roster. Any closing arguments, sir?
Sounds great to me. Let's get to the combine. I'm getting ready for it.
Yeah, excellent. All right, man. We'll talk to you in 1 week.
Sounds good. See ya.